Terror attacks, an assassination, civilians killed as they went about their daily lives. With barely 2 weeks left, 2016, it seems, wasn't done with us yet when it comes to tragedy. And as the tally of such events mounts, so does the wider significance of them for Western societies. Joining us now to consider the events of this week and how democracies can contend with violence and the fear it can engender, we welcome Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, Christian Leuprecht, professor of political science at Royal Military College of Canada and Queen's University, and Randall Hansen, director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Welcome, everybody, to a discussion I wish we didn't have to have, but here we go again. I want to recap the events of earlier this week. Andrei Karlov, the Russian ambassador to Turkey, killed in Ankara, allegedly by an off-duty police officer. A gunman wounded 3 people at an Islamic center in Zurich, Switzerland. 12 people killed and 48 injured when a truck plowed into a Christmas market in Berlin. ISIS has claimed responsibility for that. And ISIS has also claimed responsibility for a series of attacks in Jordan that have been occurring since the weekend. It may be difficult for people to think that the world has not spun hopelessly out of control when these kinds of things happen so quickly on the heels of one another. Is it wrong for them to feel that way, Janice?
It most certainly is, because you're quite right that we've had a spate of what are alleged to be terror attacks, Steve. But we always have to keep in mind that terror attacks are tragic. They kill innocent people, but they can never pose an existential threat to our societies. That's a difficult thing to say, but they can never truly threaten our societies. Sometimes the biggest challenge lies in how we respond to what are undeniably tragedies, human tragedies, but that's fundamentally what they are. We would not react that way to a terrible fire, would we? And we would have the same number of people killed or more. And we'd look at our emergency response services and we would feel enormous empathy for the families that lost people and for the people that are killed, but we would not feel this existential threat. We have to think of terrorism the same way.
Okay, Christian, it's not an existential threat. The United States is not going to disappear tomorrow. Germany's not going to disappear tomorrow. But having said that, people are dying. People are afraid. There is a sense of randomness, what's the word I'm looking for here?
Random.
There is, I was actually thinking of randomlessness. I don't know if that's too many lessnesses in there.
It is. It's random.
Why shouldn't we be afraid of what's going on right now?
Well, part is the mediatization of this, of these events, right? So as a result of, I think, the communications revolution, everybody's immediately aware when something happens. We witness the tragedies firsthand, and that then instills sort of this psychology of fear, the psychology of terror. And in that sense, the media is the lifeblood of terrorism, because that's ultimately what these attacks are after, is trying to populate our mind and have us be fearful. But at the same time, I think we need to remember that empirically, especially in Western society, I mean, we live in the safest societies we've had ever historically. Your chance of dying from violent, sort of injured types of attack is the lowest that historically it's ever been. And more people die, of course, of car accidents, or even you have a better chance of getting hit by lightning than you do of dying in a terrorist attack. But I think it's precisely as you say, it's the randomness where we're prepared for the risks, I think, when we get into a vehicle or when we cross the road in a way that we're not when these events happen. And I think we also have trouble getting ourselves just generally into the minds of people who commit these acts, because it takes, I think, such a big step to kill someone else and to kill people randomly without obvious motive or grievance. I think that's so puzzling.
Having said that, Randall, you study this. You have seen these things happen before. I suspect even you were, as you were watching your television, saying, another? 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 Am I wrong?
You're wrong and you're right. That was partly my reaction. Partly, as awful as it was, I was somewhat surprised that Berlin hadn't been hit before. So the Berlin attack horrified me, but didn't surprise me. I mean, what we have to say, I agree with my colleagues entirely on the risk, but there is something out there called Islamism. There is a poisonous ideology that has an appeal to a tiny, tiny minority of chiefly Muslims, but it is real, and we need to recognize that. And I think there's no existential threat, but there's two different threats. One, that will overreact in our security response, and two, that will demonize all Muslims, or let the right do that, and thus, in fact, do what the terrorists want us to do, which is to overreact in our laws and in our treatment of minorities, so they can say, look, these people hate Muslims.
We did see a presidential candidate in the United States use that to his advantage in the previous election campaign in the United States.
Yeah.
What about the reaction that Randall refers to in terms of security? Is there a danger of our overreacting there?
You know, I think there's a danger in both, frankly, and that's why I responded so vigorously to your question. I mean, if you look at this attack on the Christmas market in Berlin, attack a Christian celebration, right? And this, ISIS claims responsibility for this. So how do you provoke as much outrage as you can? Attack a Christmas market. You do that to undermine the Chancellor, Angela Merkel. And that's exactly what happened. The alt-right in Germany jumped all over her and has been jumping all over. Now, why do you do this? If you're ISIS, you do this to polarize German society and to sharpen the contradictions, as Marxists used to say. And that actually serves their agenda. We had the same kind of thing in the United States in the last election, right? And it polarizes opinion. And ultimately, Steve, that's the danger to a civil democracy. When you polarize opinion like that, you force people to choose sides, you push them to the extremes. That's what makes it very difficult for democracy to function in a civil way, because democracies rely on strong centers and extreme extremes. That's the
We
worry.
seem to be going the other way right now, though.
That's right.
More on the extremes and less at the center.
Right. So it's not the attacks, and you know, every one of us at this table will condemn those as horrific, but the real threat to our societies comes if we allow ourselves to be pushed to the extremes. That's the danger.
Let me pick up on your comment about Germany there, Christian, with you, because Markus Pretzel, who's the chairman of the Alternative for Germany party, referred to those killed in Berlin by tweeting, "These are Chancellor Angela Merkel's dead." Yeah. Fear is a very powerful motivator. Should we be worried about how he intends to torque the events of this past week for political gain?
So sure, I mean, people are going to try to instrumentalize these types of events. And I think it harkens to this, that I think it's not, there's a number of things that drive people to commit these acts. And religion is just one of about a dozen mechanisms that are engaged when people engage in these. And so religion per se isn't driving the violence, because otherwise we would see a lot more violence than we do. But I think the people who perpetrate the attacks use religion to justify and rationalize the act in which they engage. And because they do such and they justify it as such, that then allows opportunist politicians to capitalize on that for the sake of advancing either their own opportunistic agendas or reinterpret the fundamental values of European society in particular, which inherently, I think, in terms of its foundation, it's much more nationalistic and homogeneous and much more as a thicker conception of citizenship than we have, for instance, in North America.
You know, one interesting, just as an interesting case to look at in Zurich this week, and we didn't talk about that, there was an attack on a mosque. And it was clearly a mosque that the Somali citizens, Swiss citizens of Somali origin, use in Zurich. Very quickly, it was made clear this was not a terrorist attack, right? This was a bad blood feud between two members of the community. It was normalized very quickly as a crime, and Swiss were both Somali and non-Somali Swiss. We don't have that kind of problem here.
So important to make that distinction.
Important to make that distinction. And what they really did in their response to that attack so quickly, so different from what happened in Germany and what happened in Turkey, is they reinforced the center in the way they responded.
Let me just introduce another member to our table here, figuratively speaking, Kamran Bokhari from the Center for Global Policy and the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. He's a friend of the program. Kamran, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us from D.C. I just wonder if I could get you to weigh in on this notion of whether these kind of attacks coming as quickly as they are after one another and to some extent copycats of previous efforts, in your view, is this a new normal now?
It is indeed, and it's not something that's new. I think this normal has been in place for quite some time because we have seen in recent years the frequency of terrorist attacks and the geography increasing and expanding. So this normal has been in the making for quite some time. And to the extent that an organizational structure like ISIS or ISIS itself is engineering them, it is by design. I mean, the outcome that we are talking about, the polarization between societies and communities, is exactly the outcome that ISIS wants to see.
Randall, I found this interesting. I want to read this to you. Google searches often tell us a lot about what people are thinking. And the number of Google searches for Archduke Franz Ferdinand over the past year, look at what's happened, okay? A pretty flat line until just the other day, and now it goes off the charts. This is, of course, it was his assassination that prompted, well, they say, was the spark that lit the fuse that led to World War I. I wonder whether there was a part of you that had that go through your mind as you saw what happened to the Russian ambassador in Turkey, and whether you thought that could be a spark that lights a fuse that leads to something similar.
It didn't, actually, though it's an interesting...
It's occurred to lots of other people.
It has, yeah, clearly. No, it didn't, partly because there was a whole series of structural conditions that applied in 1914 that don't apply now. We don't have time to go into that. No, my reaction to that was how this will play out will depend on how the two strongmen react, Erdogan and Putin. So I paid close attention to them, and when they reaffirmed their rather complicated but ongoing relationship, I thought the chances of this exploding into a wider conflict were almost nil.
You know, it's interesting you brought that up because apparently after the assassination, there was, on Facebook, not only on Google, but on Facebook, there was an intense discussion. Were we on the edge of war? Was this similar to an assassination? How people on Facebook connect this? An assassination of a diplomat, right? And they went right back in their head to World War I. Now, the differences are huge. Mm-hmm. The similarities are almost non-existent. But there is a fear out there. There's a sense that people have that we're on the verge of war, and I think it's connected with the change in the United States. What we're really seeing out there, Steve, is a huge increase in uncertainty. People feel they don't know the rules of the road anymore. The systems are breaking down. And that's truly what's fueling that, rather than individual attacks.
Kamran, you know, history doesn't repeat 100 years later exactly the way it did 100 years before, but I wonder whether it went through your mind ever when you heard about the assassination in Turkey that, this did kind of sort of happen like this 100 years ago.
No, I actually didn't think of that, but I guess because I'm so close to these issues, I'm monitoring them on a daily basis that, something really big has to, beyond assassinations and whatnot, to sort of surprise who is actually doing this 24/7. But I think that I agree with Janice. For the common man, for the average person, the volume of violent attacks in the world going up, and then, countries involved in it and countries accusing each other of being involved in it, does lead the common man to question and say, are we looking at another global level conflict? And so, that is going to be a concern. But at the end of the day, I think that Russia and Turkey, given their imperatives, are locked into a relationship which isn't great and it isn't extremely bad. It's somewhere in the middle, and they will have to muddle through it.
Muddle through it. There seems to be a lot of that in international affairs these days. Well, there is a sort of beware false analogies, Christian, that I'm going to put to you here. This is a professor at the University of Virginia, Nicole Hemmer, on the dangers of looking too closely at the past for answers to today. Here's what she says. Given the uncertainty of the current moment and the players involved, the pull towards such analogies is strong, but there's a real danger here, she writes, a danger that exists in any historical analogy that draws surface comparisons while ignoring particulars. Such analogies give us a false sense of security even when the antecedents are horrific, a sense that we know what's coming next and how to respond, that everything is knowable and under control. But the reality is that we have no idea what comes next, and if we act too assuredly, too trapped within the analogy, the odds of miscalculating grow exponentially. Are there many useful parallels between what happened in the 20th century and what we're into the middle of now?
So I think part of this is driven by this phenomenon of risk society, that we've become used to the modern state in general and the welfare state in particular to risk manage our lives, whether that's saving us from unemployment or from losing our house or making sure our kids can go to school, to everything to keeping us safe and us being able to follow our lives as we choose to live them in any and all circumstances. And I think what Janice says is that this is these phenomena are all running counter to the ability of the modern state to control these phenomena. I think as a result of multiple trends of globalization that are actually undermining the ability of the state increasingly to govern even within its own jurisdiction, let alone beyond the state's jurisdictions. And so the expectations of citizens are mismatched with the capabilities of governance and the capabilities of stability more broadly.
Randall, you didn't like the comparison between the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the ambassador from Russia to Turkey, but do you see any other examples from the 20th century that we could look to right now that might help us better understand what we're in the midst of right now?
Well, firstly, I'd reaffirm the dangers of analogies. Think of Suez as Hitler. That was one of the most dangerous analogies that cost Eden his premiership and the UK its global role. I think actually history is more reassuring than terrifying. I think if we look back at terrorism in the 1970s, we realize it was higher in Europe, not in the global south, but higher in Europe than it is now. If we imagine the 1930s, the decisions we were making were far more tortured than they are now. What we have to recognize is what was in that quotation. We have no idea of what's coming next. We are dealing with radical uncertainty, and there history doesn't help.
Janice?
You know, the only thing I would say, I agree generally that historical analogies, if you take them literally, are misleading. But I think history can help provide a deeper understanding. I think the context that is elevating the fear so badly right now is that there are periods of transition, right? We have a very disruptive president-elect of the United States who ran on a campaign of disrupting existing institutions that people have known for a long time. Whether it's, and what he does is a different question, but he certainly ran on a campaign of shaking up NATO, tearing up NAFTA. So the public hears disruptive words all the time. We have ISIS that is abroad, and its goal is to eradicate state borders and to consolidate an entirely new form of governance. When you listen to that kind of talk, it's not reassuring to people. This is not about improving our system or making our system better. The talk coming from more than one place is about tearing it up, ripping it apart, backward-looking nostalgia, make us great again. That's looking back to a past that probably never quite existed that way. And I think that's what's feeding this public anxiety that we have now. People intuitively know something is changing here. History shows us that we go through periods. You just talked about the end of Britain's global role. That was a transition. There are these historical moments where one kind of system goes away and another one is put in its place. And there, I would say I'm alert to that kind of change right now.
Okay, I got to tell you how funny this is. I'm on with four political theorists, historians, world watchers who know a lot of stuff. And, you know, this George Santayana quote is rifling through my mind right now, but those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, which Margaret MacMillan, your friend, always says is the worst quote, because she says the worst thing actually is to overlearn the lesson from history, which is not applicable now. And Kamran, none of you apparently are exercised enough about what has transpired 50 or 100 years ago to sort of say with certainty what we're up to right now. I hate to say, so what are we listening to any of you for the rest of this program, because I don't want people turning off. But okay, give us a reason why we should keep listening to what you guys have to say.
I mean, obviously, every one of us has a different approach to understanding this. I mean, we are analysts. We are trying to understand. Some of us go back to history, and some of us say, okay, you know, how much history can actually inform our thinking or should inform our thinking. I mean, to go back to your earlier question, you know, I think that if you go back to the Cold War, there were multiple theaters of the Cold War. The difference was that the Cold War was understandable given the logic that, okay, you have multiple theaters in which the United States and the former Soviet Union were engaged in proxy conflicts. We have a similar global level disorder, but with greater uncertainty because, as Janice was saying, we have disruptive elements. And I would take that a bit further, and I would say that there is a conflict going on between those who long for sort of this internationalist view of the world, the one that took shape after 1945, the one in which the UN matters, the World Bank, the IMF, international institutions helping keeping the peace and the progress moving forward. And there are those who are promoting nationalism, and that also is because a lot of this prosperity really hasn't trickled down to the masses, who then go out and vote for the exit of Great Britain from Europe, and they elect Donald Trump. And so, yes, there is a instrumentalization of these sentiments on the part of the political elites, but I think deep down there is this clash between nationalists and internationalists.
Janice, you wanted to follow up.
You asked us why history matters at all. History is great at telling you what's different about the current situation from the past. It's generally misused to tell you what's similar, and you were right about that, Steve. We reach back for analogies, but people who take history seriously look at how it's different as well as how it's similar, and that's where a lot of really productive learning takes place. If I look back, I'm not worried about assassinations as triggers, which is the discussion that was taking place on social media all week. I'm much more concerned about whether we are at the end of the liberal international order that's been in place since 1948. Will that?
Do you fear we are?
Yes, I think that's a possibility. And that's why we may be at a really important transition point. If we are at that kind of hinge moment where we could go either way, because I don't believe history's determined, then holding the center in liberal democratic societies is really critical. It's not only critical for Germany and for Canada and for the United States, but it's critical for that broader liberal international order.
I want to know, there's two words you said in the midst of that answer that I want to follow up with you on: social media. And I wonder how much more difficult it is to hold that center when you've got when you have platforms on social media that are just cesspools for extremism. Tell me about how difficult that is.
Yeah, I mean, the whole phenomenon of incitement, I think, is something that democracy will fundamentally have to wrestle with, and that there are just simply some forms of speech that are not acceptable. But previously, we had opportunity within our laws and our jurisdictions to control that through hate speech and whatnot. But now this is largely beyond the reach of the state. And then, of course, we have some jurisdictions that consider any form of speech acceptable, whereas in Canada, we've restricted that to expression and meaningful expression. And so I think trying to understand what obligations also large companies have. When car companies first came on the road, it was the automobile clubs that put up the road signs. And then eventually we learned that we got to put seatbelts into cars, and we got to have standards for safety and for brakes and whatnot. And there's, I think, a growing debate about what obligations do companies have. And the only way that we enforce these right now seems to be through litigation and through massive litigation, especially by the European Commission. And I think we need to find better ways to both cooperate with these companies, but also to regulate what is not acceptable and what when hostile states deliberately exploit social media to undermine democratic debate and to fuel rage and uncertainty and illiberal sentiment, then clearly the state needs to step in and say there are boundaries to what can be tolerated, even on electronic communication. That doesn't mean I want to censor the internet per se, but I think the companies that provide these platforms have a broader obligation than they've realized so far.
And a broader obligation than they have realized so far. So would you say it's up to them to sort of pick up their game?
Ultimately, I think we live in a global era, and so we need to work this out collaboratively with them. And we also need to make them understand that it is part of their corporate interest. I think once we see, for instance, some of the civil suits in the United States against entities such as Facebook and Twitter that are actively being sued, largely, for instance, by Jewish plaintiffs that have suffered at the hands of Hezbollah and Hamas, once we see, I think, very large settlements potentially being paid out, then all of a sudden companies will realize in the corporate boardroom that we need to restrain our corporate culture.
Let me bring this up, because I don't want the clock to get get away from us before we have a chance to discuss this in some depth here. Reality with perception as it relates to Muslim populations in various countries. These are Ipsos Mori numbers surveying in 40 countries. And take a look at this. In Canada, when people were asked, what's the Muslim population of Canada? They guessed 17%, that blue bar on the left. In fact, it's 3.2%. When they asked people in Germany the same question, they thought 21% of Germany's population was Muslim. In fact, it's 5%. In France, people thought a third of France's population is made up of Muslims. In fact, it's 7.5%. Same across the board there. In the United Kingdom, 15% was the perception. It's actually less than 5%. In Belgium, nearly a quarter, and in fact, it's 7%. And in Sweden, people thought that the Swedish Muslim population was 17%. In fact, it's not even 5%. Randall, you first and then Kamran on this. What do you infer from those numbers?
Well, the first point to make is that's a common pattern. Every time people are asked the percentage of any immigrant group or immigrants in general in the society, they always vastly exaggerate it. So in a sense, it's not a new finding. Right. What might be slightly different, or at least worth noting here, is that you have a rhetoric, particularly in continental Europe, about a flood of Muslims, and the alt-right in America and the Twitter sphere is full of this. Muslims are flooding Europe, they're taking it over, they're overrunning Europe. And in that sort of rhetorical and frankly really racist context, it's not surprising that people exaggerate or overestimate the numbers.
Kamran, your view on those numbers?
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, we live in a world where, even in the United States, a great many people were under the impression that President Barack Obama was a Muslim. A lot more thought that he was never born in the United States. So we live in a world where conspiracy theories are rife. Political, economic conditions are creating conflict between, those who see themselves as the have-nots, and they see that their well-being was undermined by immigration. And so, all these things come together to produce that kind of outcome. And then, if you look at what we call the open sources, with the onset of the internet technology, and more recently with social media platforms, the sources of information have grown exponentially. And what is available to people who really cannot discern between, outright falsehood and statistics, it becomes staggering, because you just have so many people consuming what is being produced on the internet.
I don't want to exaggerate the import of this, Janice, but I do find it fascinating that when there's a population of 3.2% in Canada that's Muslim, that somehow people think it's actually 5 times that size.
I think you find it fascinating because you believe in accuracy.
Well, I'm not one of these guys who thinks we're in a post-truth world. I'm still fighting the good fight for truth.
But let me just tell
you,
I don't know if all our viewers would know the book, but Danny Kahneman wrote a wonderful book called Thinking, Fast and Slow. And one of the things we know is a universal pattern is really awful estimates of probability. People get it horribly wrong. What they think is important, they over-exaggerate dramatically. You do it too. I do it. It's a systematic error that human beings
make. When do I do it? I don't do that.
You do it. I just have to find the right question. And if I asked you about home runs in Rogers Stadium, I think we get a wildly over-exaggerated number.
I think I'd be right on the money. That's just my opinion.
So I'm not as...
But this happens across the spectrum in many different fields.
Yes. So, but what it does tell us, though, so I'm not horrified, I'm not upset, it's exactly as I would predict, but what it does tell us, Steve, is that the proportion of Muslims as a part of our society is high in public awareness. That's why we're getting exaggeration. And so there is an overemphasis, a fixation on the Muslim component of our population. If you had asked this question 70 years ago and substituted Jews for Muslims, you would have gotten the same exaggerated numbers. So it's in the context of narratives, stories, tropes, whatever you want to call this. And I do think social media plays a very, very destructive role in this conversation. I'm not as confident as Christian that we can regulate it. My only residual hope is these are public corporations, and we've always been able to regulate public corporations. In the end, they've had to knuckle under because they had corporate interests. But I think this is really tough, and it's really destructive, and it reinforces, again, fears and stories that people tell, and it leads to this kind of, frankly, wildly inaccurate predictions.
Does this distress you?
Look, there's a corollary to that, right? So often in these surveys, the next question then is, well, do you know any immigrants? And people will answer, yeah, my neighbor is an immigrant, and do you like them? Oh, yeah, they have me over, and they cook terrific food and whatnot.
Nice
so
people.
when you get it to the relational level, then people tune out of this immigrant factor. But I think when we ask these sorts of data, there's also some important distinctions. That in Europe, when we talk about immigration, these are Gastarbeiter, they're asylum seekers, they're refugees. It is ultimately very difficult to become part of European society if you weren't born there and you're not part of this thick conception of citizenship. Whereas in Canada, we don't really bring asylum seekers or refugees or so to this country. We bring future Canadians to this country. We don't expect people ever to return to their home country. And so I think we have a completely different conception of people coming to Canada, setting up roots and becoming part of Canadian society.
It's also our geographical isolation. I mean, we have the privilege. We get almost no refugees because no one can get here.
Small numbers.
And we accept mostly very highly educated, skilled immigrants who do well in the labor market. Europe, and above all Germany, is in the center of the storm. Almost 1 million asylum seekers in 2015. You can't compare that with Canada.
We've got a few minutes left here, folks, and I want to try and get one more thing on the table here, and that picks up on something, Janice, that you talked about a few moments ago. What do we do to try to ensure that our Western-style liberal democracies will remain strong and remain vibrant going forward? Kamran, will you come in on that first? It sure feels like the arc of history is going against them right now.
Yes.
So what do we do to stop that?
I mean, I think that there are constraints on society as a whole because you have anti-system forces really gnawing at that order. And I mean, this is not just in the United States and Great Britain, the two examples that I gave earlier. I mean, you're seeing this in France, you're seeing this in Italy and Germany. And so I think that at the end of the day, we're going through a cycle that somehow we may not be able to avoid it altogether. But if one particular way in which the center can be held together is for mainstream parties to start addressing the problem of the masses. And that may be difficult because they are faced by constraints, political and economic, to how much they can improve the lot of the common man, how much they can alleviate the fears of society when it comes to security and their economic well-being.
Okay, forgive me, Kamran, I'm jumping in there because I want to make sure with 3 minutes left we get everybody in on this. Randall, go ahead.
Well, I mean, we partly fight back. I mean, liberals have been apologizing all over themselves, self-flagellating since the election. It was the right-wing governments, it was Republicans and conservatives that destroyed the Midwest, not liberals. The Democrats wanted to help those people, and we stop apologizing for advances in rights of racialized minorities, women, and LGBT people. We defend liberalism on the Twitter sphere and on panels like this. That's what we do.
Compete.
Absolutely. Don't give up the fight.
So I agree. I think there's lots of things we can do, but it's important that our political leaders concert their efforts here. One is we have to regulate social media. It's intolerable that you get truthiness as a substitute for truth. You know, no democracy is going to survive in a truthy environment.
Well,
That's
even Facebook
one.
is putting a red box now around the things they think are
So
fake
there are
news.
things we can do, and we have to fight back on this. It really matters. Second thing we have to do, Steve, is we have to make government work for people. And that's really important. That's a whole other panel discussion, but we have to make government work. And thirdly, we have to be more transparent. Conspiracy theories thrive when there's lack of transparency. And we can do a lot better than we're doing, but we have to hold ourselves, our societies to account. We have to compete, and we have to be aware that this is an important moment, and we have to do a lot better than we've been doing.
Sunlight's a great disinfectant, eh? Okay, you get the last word, Christian.
I think democracy, what we're learning is we've taken democracy for granted, and democracy is something to be defended and has always needed to be defend it, and being able to stand up for what we believe in and what it is to be right and wrong, and that politics matter again. The challenge is that we live with institutions, legislative frameworks from the 19th and 20th century that are really unable to govern the sort of flows and dynamics of globalization of the 21st century. And so what will be interesting to watch is what elements and constructs are emerging that will allow us to govern these flows that really don't stop at jurisdictional sovereign boundaries as we've traditionally conceived them.
Good to have 4 people on tonight prepared to fight that good fight. Kamran Bokhari, pleasure to have you on from the Center for Global Policy in Washington, D.C. We got the all-star team from the Monk School over there on the left-hand side of the table, Janice Stein and Randall Hansen, and then Christian Leuprecht from RMC and Queens over on the other side of the table. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.